Started. Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Gabriel, and on behalf of Darien Library, we welcome you to our program this afternoon, The Strategic Significance of the Japanese Attack on Pearl Harbor with Mark Albertson. On December 7th, 1941 at 7:55 a.m. Hawaii time, the attack on Pearl Harbor commenced. Today marks the 80th anniversary of this event. Mark will explore in depth its significance that changed the course of American history and the world. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this possible and our collections available to the community. Our presenter is no stranger to most of you attending this presentation. He is the historical research editor at Army Aviation magazine and a professor of history at Norwalk Community College, a recipient of a General Assembly Citation from our state legislature for his work in commemorating the centennial of the battleship Connecticut. We welcome our speaker, Mark Albertson. Mark.
Oh, thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon. Yeah, this is about the time. This is obviously the day, but it's just a little after 4 p.m. here. And we are about 6 hours ahead of Hawaii time, if you go through the time zone. So we are almost not only 80 years, but even arguably to the minute, to the hour for this day. And I'm not going to go into the attack itself. You can turn television on every December and get that on the military channel or the American American Heroes channel, or even PBS will air this. But as opposed to why? How come the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor? There is a reason for it. They just didn't do this. But you know, before this is over, you're going to find that there's a lot of things going on that's changing the global dynamics of power. And when we get to the end of this, you're going to see that Pearl Harbor, together with the Battle of Moscow in the Soviet Union, is really the turning point of this conflict. A conflict that did not start in 1939, but actually started in 1914. And the first port of call here will be the rise of Japan as a power. Coming out of the 19th century, you know, in 1853, when you went to school, I'm sure 1853, the Commodore Perry and his 4 black ships going to Japan. And many narratives of this, you know, we open up Japan. Well, the British had already been here, the Spanish had already been here, the Dutch, the Portuguese, so on and so forth, the French. But we're just another one of the Western powers going to Japan. But the Japanese are not going to go the way of the Afghans or the Indians or the people in the Dutch East Indies or even in China or Southeast Asia. They see what's going on in these areas. Colonialism, Western colonialism, and they're not going to go this route. So they are, you know, it's the old saying, if you can't beat them, join them. And that's exactly what they're going to do. They are going to learn to industrialize. They're capitalism, finance. This is what they're going to do. And they opt for a diet. You know, a parliamentary procedure, a form of government, despite the fact they maintain the emperor, who's supposed to be an earthly god, yet they're going to have to get rid of the samurai class of warriors, that noble class of warriors that really had dominated Japan for centuries. And these guys aren't going to go quietly into the dark. They're going to have to be, let's use the term, motivated. And that means by violence. But seeing that Japan is modernizing and they are going to become the Asian power. You know, that old saying, and you've heard this before, that power seems to be going to Asia. And maybe this is the start. It's not the Chinese, it's the Japanese. And so what they're going to do is put together a conscript army. They're going to bring the French in to train the army. They also understand something known as geography. They are an island power. And they see something here they have an affinity here. England, they have an affinity for the English. The Royal Navy is what lends credence to the British Empire. You can't have the empire, you can't have the British Empire without the Royal Navy. And so the Japanese are going to engage in naval power. And how they're going to do this, they're going to bring in the French to train the army and the British to train the Navy and help them organize a Navy. In fact, with the 1870-71 war in Europe, the Germans beat the French. Otto von Bismarck beats the French. And so the Japanese are going to kick out the French and bring in the Germans to train the army. And by 1890, the Japanese are going to have a British trained Navy and a German trained army. How good does this get? And so they're going to go to war with China, 1894. It's the Sino-Japanese War. And they're going to kick the Chinese out of Korea, take the Liaotung Peninsula, Yellow Sea, Port Arthur, and threaten Peking. The Chinese sue for peace. And in the resulting agreement, the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Japanese will get Korea, the Liaotung Peninsula, Yellow Sea, Port Arthur, and the Pescador Islands. Plus, they'll get a large indemnity from the Chinese government. You know, back in the day, that's what happened. If you lost the war, you had to pay for the privilege of financing the winner's costs. Is really what you're doing here. However, it becomes abundantly clear to the Japanese, you know, they're trying to move into this club of imperialist powers, but it becomes abundantly clear to them that unless you're white, Christian, and European, you need not apply. And France, Germany, Tsarist Russia jump on the Japanese politically. Get out. You can't stay in Korea, the Liaotung Peninsula, Port Arthur. Get out. The money you can keep, the Pescador Islands you can keep. And so they don't want anybody the Europeans don't want anybody in this club who has round heads, yellow skin, and slanted eyes. You know, there goes the neighborhood. That's not what they want here. And so between 1897 and 1902, the Japanese, who are angry, will add 4 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 23 destroyers to the Imperial Navy. Now, keep in mind at the same time, another imperialist power is coming up. They will, in the 1898 war, Spanish-American War, beat the Spanish. Now, I'm talking about the United States. This country is severing its colonial roots. And by the mid-1890s, it has already displaced the British as the world's ranking industrial power. And in that war of 1898, it gets the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba becomes a free nation, if you're willing to believe that one. And at the same time here, it's interesting what's happening with the dynamics of power. You know, you're getting into the 20th century. And with the United States now, the world's ranking industrial power, you are beginning to see that the approaching decline here of the Europeans and competitors rising up. 2 of them are the United States and Japan. However, in 1902, the British, concerned with threats to Tsarist Russia in the Pacific, form an alliance with the Japanese. And with this alliance in 1902, if either party, Japan or Britain, is attacked by Tsarist Russia, as long as Tsarist Russia has help, the other party will jump in. Well, in the 1945 Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese destroy Tsarist Russian naval power in the Pacific and kick the Russians out of Korea. Now they grab Korea. But they have done the British a favor because the British are concerned with the threat posed by Tsarist Russia against colonial India and Afghanistan. And they don't want them in the Middle East. That's the last place they want them, because now oil is going to become important for naval powers. That's coming. But here, interestingly enough, this is the era too of the great battleship race. And the British shipyards were building most of the Japanese war vessels. However, Japan is building up capacity to build ships too. But at this point, Britain, the shipyards, with the great battleship race, starting about 1895 until the advent of the aircraft carrier. Interesting, between 1907 and 1910, 70 of these ships were in various stages of completion in the world's largest yards. And besides, naval power is important in the Pacific. It's the world's largest ocean. It's the world's largest ocean. But British shipyards here, they're going 8 hours. They're going 25 hours a day, 8 days a week. But it's really interesting seeing the defining powers that are moving up here. 1914, what we call the First World War starts. Let's understand something here, and this really is significant for me here. There is no World War I or World War II. There's only one war. The war starts in 1914. It doesn't come to a conclusion. The shooting doesn't stop in 1918 with Armistice Day. It stops in 1922. Then the war is jump-started by the Japanese in 1931 and will continue on till its conclusion, 1945. This is man's greatest industrialized conflict, and it's the European colonial powers that start this war. Quite frankly, the British and the French don't want the Germans in this club of imperialist powers. And when this war starts in 1914, Japan is going to be an ally to the British and the French and Tsarist Russia. Now, interesting where this goes, because in 1917, April 6th to be exact, Congress issues the declaration of war that Woodrow Wilson asked for on April 2nd. And so here the United States becomes an ally of the British, the French, well, Russia's bowing out at this point because they're falling apart, and Japan and Italy. And so when the shooting is over in Europe, again, the shooting is over in Europe, November 11, 1918. By Europe, I mean France. Okay, the shooting is over here. Many consider this the end of the war. It's not the end of the war. Versailles Treaty, June 28, 1919, ends the conflict in Western Europe. There's war going on in many places. For instance, Germany has fallen apart. 1918, 1919, the rise of the Freikorps, those paramilitaries, men cashiered out of the military, men out of work, factories shut down. Germany's a basket case. And so these right-wing extremists paramilitaries, the Freikorps, overseen in many instances by the German army and to a lesser extent by the Navy, and some people with a few bucks, businessmen, bankers. There's over 70 of these groups, many of them with 3,000 to 5,000 men apiece, and they're fighting the communists in the streets. They are also doing something else. They are fighting here vengeful Czechs and Poles on the Eastern German frontier who want more territory. Remember, Czechoslovakia is a new country. Poland has come back from 1795. It is now a newly minted state. So there's fighting going on the Eastern German frontier. Poland, not satisfied with the territory it's going to get out of Versailles, invades Bolshevik Russia that's in the convulsive state of civil war. That's another aspect of this. The Russian Revolution gives way to civil war, 1918, 1921. The Poles invade Russia, 1919. And they are going through Ukraine. And it's Trotsky and the Red Army that throw them back at Kiev. And so that war goes on in 1921. How about the Middle East? The Ottoman Empire no longer exists. And the British and the French, starting with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, draw the borders in the sand with this collapsed Ottoman Empire. Iraq, in fact, this October 2nd of 2022 will really mark the 90th anniversary of Iraq as a really bona fide nation. It joins the League of Nations. Iraq is really only 90 years old. We don't understand that here. The British and French drew the borders and arranged Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, later Jordan, Palestine, Syria. And of course, the British are the major protagonists here. Why? Because they're already pumping the oil out of Iran. You don't think they don't think there's oil in what they're going to call Iraq? However, interesting, in 1919, the Syrians rise up to throw the French out, and they're going to get crushed. 1920, Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds drop their differences in this newly minted Iraq to throw the British out, and they fail. Anatolia, the Turkish homeland. Turkey, as you see it today, wasn't just formed. They had a fight for it. The British, the French, the Greeks, and the Italians are going to Christianize Anatolia. Now, that's going to make the Turks real happy. So Kemal Ataturk puts together elements of the Ottoman army, and he's going to throw out the British, the French, the Greeks, and the Italians. There is going to be no Armenia, and there is going to be no Kurdistan. This is called the Turkish War of Independence, 1919, 1922. The war is over in 1918? No, it's not. There's still fighting going on here. And with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, Turkey, as you see it, comes to exist. But what happens after this? You know, the Treaty of Versailles is the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on modern man. If the British and the French were that enamored with democratic principles, they would have helped the solidification of representative government in Germany. But no, they're interested more, especially the French, in reparations. This war was deemed having been fought for democracy. That's bunk. This war was fought for money, colonies, politics, and power. That's what it was fought for. Now, it's interesting here when you get back to the Western Europeans, since that's the case, it cost the British 965,000 dead to preserve her colonies. It cost the French 1,565,000 dead to keep her colonies. Cost the Germans 1,770,000 dead, and they lose their colonies. It's the Japanese that come out of this smelling like a rose. They are being a dutiful ally. They are going to get many of the colonies the Germans had in the Pacific, Marshall Islands being one of them, at a cost of only 300 or 400 dead. It's fascinating what's progressing here. Now, at the same time, getting into the 1920s, the Japanese are moving more and more irrevocably to the right. They are trying to get their Asian neighbors to go with the agenda of, Asia for Asians. Let's throw out the white Christian colonial powers. Haku Ichu is a Japanese doctrine, bringing the 8 corners of the world under a single roof. That is a Japanese roof. Kodo Ha, the way of the emperor. The emperor is considered to be a living god. Of course, there are, if you want to believe that stuff, many dutiful Japanese do. Of course, the atomic bombs are going to destroy that myth. If this guy was a god, he wouldn't have allowed Hiroshima and Nagasaki to be incinerated. So the bombs prove that this is bogus, right? And so here you see, though, they are moving more and more to the right. And having said that, interesting, the idea of Kodo Ha and Hakuichu. What are the Nazis going to be proclaiming for Germany? Lebensraum, living space, the Führer principle, Hitler, the leader. It doesn't make any difference the face of fascism, whether they have round heads, slanted eyes, or yellow skin, or square heads, blue eyes, and have blonde hair. The face of fascism is the same. We need to understand this. However, interestingly enough, the Japanese are going to organize this program under something known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. That's what it's going to be called. Asia for Asians. Yeah, as long as they run it. So the optimum attempt here is these people who they're urging to throw out their white Christian European overseers, they're going to be trading just one overseer for another. Depression, October 29, 1929. For a few years here, the Japanese, every year that goes by here, they have another 1,000,000 mouths to feed. Another 1,000,000 mouths to feed. And Japan, of the major powers that are developing, is resource poor. They have no oil. They have no oil. However, in 1931, they will invade Manchuria. Here, they're going to get more coal, iron ore, manganese, tungsten, and other resources. They use Korea as that jump-off point onto the Asian mainland. Now, let's understand something. This is not really the Japanese government that perpetrates this incident. It's the Japanese army. The Japanese military is taking control here. In fact, the Japanese army is going to run the school system. And, by the early 30s, a young Japanese kid, boys, not girls, will be able to take apart an Arisaka rifle and put it back together again. Besides learning the 3 R's, they're being militarily trained in the schools. However, the Kwantung Army, which is what this is going to be known as, is what takes control of Manchuria, not the Japanese government. In fact, this is a period beginning in the late 1920s, where in Japan it was known as that period of government by assassination. Government officials of a moderate and left-wing variety, if they didn't get with the program, were assassinated. And there were extreme right-wing factions supporting this, like the Black Dragons. In fact, you can find old movies going back to the 40s, some of the serials. I'm an old serial collector. I've got a serial, The Black Dragons. Yeah, Hollywood got into this. Interesting, 15-chapter serial. But that's what's going on in Japan. However, interestingly enough, 1933 in the United States, March 4 to be exact, because that's when presidents were inaugurated. March 4, Franklin D. Roosevelt is the president of the United States. At a time, it's probably the worst year of the Depression. 9,000 banks have closed. 1/4 of the American workforce is on the streets. The same year as what happened in Germany, January 30, 1933, Hitler, is picked to be the chancellor. Now, he didn't take power. The chancellorship was given to him by President Paul von Hindenburg, who was being pressured by businessmen, bankers, and the army to install Hitler. Well, they're not going to install the communists. Businessmen and bankers, they get along with communists here? No, not in Germany. And so they choose Hitler. We are hiring him. How'd that work out in the long run, right? And so the global, again, you see more pieces here where the global dynamics of power are beginning to change. Soviet Union, Stalin. Stalin, if you recall your history of Bolshevik Russia, Lenin died in January of 1924, and supposedly with his last will and testament did not want Stalin to be his heir. He wanted Trotsky. Yet Trotsky, a brilliant theorist, brilliant writer, wonderful orator, horrible backroom politician. Stalin, by the way, was General Secretary of the party in 1922. And what do you think he's doing? He's staffing various party portfolios with people who owe their lot in life to him. And so in the 1926 Party Congress, when the roll call vote is taken, guess who's going to be the heir to Trotsky? To Lenin? Stalin. Trotsky's eventually going to be given his train tickets to get out of the Soviet Union. So Stalin is the heir to Trotsky, to Lenin. Now, what he's going to do here is in 1927, Stalin's no chump. Stalin understands the plight of Russia in 1914 when the Tsar mobilized Russia to go to war. Russia was the least industrialized, least organized, least prepared for war. Not on Stalin's watch. And in 1927, he begins to collectivize the peasants, and he's going to pinch some of their grain and livestock. He's going to offshore some of this grain and livestock besides feeding the cities, and he's going to bring in hard currency. And with that hard currency, he's going to bring in American, British, and French engineers. He's going to industrialize the Soviet Union. If they want to be industrialized or not, doesn't make a difference. And so he's going to focus on heavy industries, machine tools, tractors. Here's a country, the Soviet Union, again, Stalin understands, you've got these peasants, it's 90% peasant going into this episode. You got these peasants plowing their fields with horses and mules. This country's awash in oil. Can't you produce more food with tractors? That's how Stalin thinks. Yet, what can you convert tractor factories into in time of war? Tanks. You see where he's going here? And so in the first 5 years, the first 5-year plan, 1927, 1932, industrial production goes up 250%. The second plan, 1933, 1938, over 260% it went up. Stalin is concentrating on heavy industry because that's how he sees this as the answer to the Soviet Union's problem of staying alive, because he knows war is industrialized war. That's what we're in at this point. It's industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war, hence the high death toll. The more factories you have, the more weapons you can produce. But you need to conscript entire populations now for war. Why? Because the loss rate's going up. And this is financed by capitalism. Finances the evolution of the technology of weapons. This is where you're going here. This is where you're going. Stalin, too, you can say whatever you want about Uncle Joe, as he was known here during the war, but this man's going to take this country from 1927 to 1949, from a backward peasant economy to an atomic bomb in a generation. And Stalin said, we are going to accomplish in 25 years what it took America 100. And understand this concept. Soviet industrial production during the second part of the war, beginning in 41, will be one of the biggest keys for Allied victory. And we're going to get to that before this is finished. 1934, Adolf Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with Poland. Even promises the Poles off the cuff, maybe later on down the road, we can get you some territory out of the Soviet Union. Now, again, Hitler's no chump. He knows Germany's in between Poland and France. So if he signs a non-aggression pact with Poland, they won't sign one with the French. 1934 as well. Maxim Litvinov, Stalin's commissar for foreign affairs. We ought to form an alliance here within the League of Nations with the British and the French to rein in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Stalin agrees to this, collective security. Where is this going to go? In 1935, the 1931, the Japanese had invaded Manchuria. They are going to leave. The Japanese are going to leave not only the League of Nations, they are going to leave the 1922 naval agreement, which they signed in Washington, D.C. in February 1922. They're also going to leave another naval agreement in 1930. They're going off on their own, is what they're doing here. They're building their armed forces. 1935, Mussolini attacks Ethiopia. Now, 1935 too is important because the Germans and the British sign a naval agreement. It's known in history as the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, June 15, 1935. In this agreement, the Germans are allowed to build up to 35% of British naval tonnage. What happened to the Versailles Treaty? They're not supposed to have a large navy. They are also, interesting, they're also able to build up to 45% of British submarine tonnage. They're not supposed to have submarines. And there's an escape clause here. The Germans, with a 6-month notice, can build up to 100% of British submarine tonnage. Now, what's interesting is on June 30, 1935, 2 weeks later, the Germans launched their first submarine. You mean they built a sub in 2 weeks? I mean, let's get real here. Hitler announces the advent of the Luftwaffe, the new German Air Force. He also states, now Germany is not supposed to have any more than 100,000 men in its army. That's in the Versailles Treaty. He's going to have a 36 division army. That's not 100,000 men. But what's happened? Why aren't the British and the French complaining? I mean, why are they, why, especially the British, why are they doing this? What happened to the Versailles Treaty here? 1936, March 7 to be exact. Hitler sends 2 battalions of the new German army into the Rhineland, which is a German province on the eastern French frontier. The French could have mobilized 100 divisions. Again, violation of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler is not supposed to militarize the Rhineland 50 kilometers from the French border. There's really no response. 1937. 1937, Japan invades China. This is the start of an 8-year war that will claim upwards of 15 million Chinese. 1938, spring 1936, the Spanish Civil War, which is really a tune-up for 1939, that's going on. But in 1938, spring 1938, Hitler absorbs Austria into the German Reich. Now, again, the Versailles Treaty, these two are supposed to be split, Germany and Austria. They're not supposed to amalgamate here, but that they do now. It's called the Anschluss. Fall 1938. Hitler is able to sliver off the Sudetenland, where 2 or 3 million German-speaking people live, which was part of the Czech Republic, which part of Czechoslovakia. And if you remember the newsreel footage of Neville Chamberlain at Heathrow Airport waving that paper that Hitler signed, peace in our time. And Hitler saying, I'd have no more territorial demands to make in Europe. And yet 6 months later, in by March 13, 15, 1939, he will dismember the rest of Czechoslovakia. So that 20-year experiment coming out of the Versailles Treaty, known as Czechoslovakia, is wiped off the map as a free state. Yet interesting, what else happens here in 1939? The United States government has been trying to get Japan out of China and has failed to do so. We have this is really significant. We have an agreement with the Japanese. It's called the Treaty of Commerce and Navigation. We consummated this treaty with Tokyo in February of 1911. Now, this guides a lot of the US and Japanese economic interaction. We have a number of treaties like this with various nations. This one we're concerned with is the one with Japan. There's an article here called Article 17. And in this Article 17 of this agreement, that if either party wants to abrogate the agreement, then they have to give the other signer a 6-month notice. Okay, so since the Japanese won't get out of China, on July 26, 1939, the United States government informs the Japanese government that anytime we wish, we can abrogate the agreement. January 26, 1940, the United States government informs the Japanese that, yes, we are going to abrogate this agreement. The Japanese know now, that anytime Roosevelt wants, he can freeze their assets here and he can cut them off from the oil. Now, interesting what is happening in Europe. August 23, 24, 1939, 2:30 in the morning in Moscow. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two diametrically opposed political structures here, sign an agreement. Hitler wants this agreement because he wants to wipe Poland off the map. And so Joachim von Ribbentrop, who's the Nazi Germany's foreign minister, and Vyacheslav Molotov, who replaced Litvinov as the Commissar for Foreign Affairs in the Soviet Union, have signed this agreement at 2:30 in the morning in Moscow, August 23, 24, 1939. It's known in history as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. I wrote an article on this, over 5,500 words, in World War II History magazine about 4 or 5 years ago. And interesting, Stalin, after it's signed, orders champagne to be poured, and he proposes a toast to Hitler, to Adolf Hitler. What a fine fellow. He's going to change his opinion later on down the road. And on September 1st, 1939, Germany steamrollers Poland from the west. On September 17, 1939, the Soviets steamroller Poland from the east. And Poland, again, like Czechoslovakia, this newly minted Poland coming out of the Versailles Treaty as an independent state, wiped off the map. So much for Versailles. It's not the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on modern man. April 9, 1940, Adolf Hitler invades Denmark and Norway. May 10, 1940, Hitler invades France and the Low Countries in Western Europe. Many people were under the impression that Hitler's going to get stuck here in France. That's what happened in 1914, right? Hitler said, even professed, the next war will not be fought like the last war. And while the French are on the timetable of 1914, Hitler's on the timetable of 1940. The tank, the aircraft, close support of the tank. France falls in 6 weeks. The world is stunned. Stalin accelerates his rearmament program. The Germans do get a hiccup here, suffer a hiccup here with the Battle of Britain. You know, Goering said that his Luftwaffe will destroy the RAF. That doesn't happen. The British hold on, although they're not a threat at this point. September 1940, northern French Indochina is invaded by the Japanese. Now, the Japanese do not take control of most of French Indochina. Vichy France is running that. But the northern border area of Indochina to China is now occupied by the Japanese. The reason being, America was sending supplies through French Indochina to Chiang Kai-shek. So the Japanese are trying to close off this hole. At the same time this is going on, Hitler is launching a diplomatic blitz in the Balkans. Now, the people who live in the Balkans are generally Slavs. The Russians find this really an insult to the agreement of 1939. They're in the Soviet backyard. The Soviets don't like this. And so Hitler says, well, maybe we need a conference here to clarify the situation. So he invites Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's Commissar of Foreign Affairs, to Berlin. The first meeting occurs on November 13, 1940. And in this meeting, Paul Schmidt is Hitler's interpreter. And he said, because I've seen the interview with Schmidt, that Molotov didn't spare Hitler at all, came right at him. You know, German, he's concerned with Finland. He says Finland is a threat. He says you invite people from Finland to Germany, and people from Germany go to Finland. And he says the Finns are a threat to our security, to which we're going to have to do something about this. And he tells Hitler to his face, we are going to do something about this. Whereupon Hitler explodes. I understand you well, Molotov. You want to wage war against the Finns. And that's out of the question. Do you understand me? That's out of the question. Hitler's concern is with his iron ore shipments from Sweden. 45% of German iron ore is coming from Sweden. But he doesn't want the Soviets getting into Finland. They've already had that short war with them from November 30, 1939 to March 13, 1940. It was called the Winter War. But he doesn't want Finland wiped off the map. That's not what he wants. And so the next night they're having a meeting inside the Reich Chancellery, and they're meeting in the evening, and they're around this heavy oaken table. Well, the lights flash, the alarms go off, the British are launching a bombing raid. Now, this is a pinprick raid. It's not a serious raid like they'll be able to launch 2 years from now. And so Hitler and Molotov wind up under the table. Hitler has the temerity to tell Molotov, you know, the British are finished. And Molotov replies, well, if the British are finished, then from whose bombs are we hiding from, and why are we under this table? You know, this meeting did not go well. but it's irrelevant. Hitler is already planning the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. But another event occurs that month of November 1940. The British aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious sends off 21 torpedo planes that attacks the Italian fleet at the Italian Navy base in Taranto, Italy. They sink 2 men of war and damage 3 others. There's a crackerjack young naval lieutenant of the Japanese Imperial Navy in the Japanese embassy in Berlin. He gathers together as much information as he can on this attack, collates it, puts it in a diplomatic bag, has it sent to Tokyo. This winds up on Admiral Yamamoto's desk. He, in turn, this is where the Japanese begin to get the idea of attacking Pearl Harbor. And they begin planning this attack in January of 1941. Now, remember what I said before about that Treaty of Commerce and Navigation. Many Americans are under the mistaken impression that when Roosevelt finally cuts the Japanese off from oil and freezes their assets here on July 26, 1941, that's when the Japanese begin planning Pearl Harbor. Wrong. They were planning this starting in January of 1941. You know, it's a bit better to understand it once you get the chronology correct. Yet, at the same time, in January 1941, there's a meeting going on in Quebec between American and British commanders. They had actually been meeting on and off since 1938. And here it's decided that if America gets into the war, remember, this is January 41. If America gets into the war, that the Hitler and Nazi Germany will be considered the #1 threat. The Japanese will be considered the #2 threat. I've seen the interview with Vannevar Bush. He talks about this. Vannevar Bush was a member of the Roosevelt administration. He will help organize our economy for the war. And he talked about this. And they said, yeah, the great commanders were meeting up in Quebec, and they came to the agreement that yes, when if America gets into the war, Hitler will be the #1 threat, the Japanese the #2 threat. You know how he put this? Interesting. But note the time though, 1940, 41. He said yes. He said the Germans were the #1 threat, and he said those Japs, we can take care of them in our own good time. That was the attitude. Interesting. But that's January 1941. April 1941. There's an American destroyer in the Atlantic, the USS Niblack. The sonar operator finds a blip on his sonar screen, and the captain orders that blip depth charged. Roosevelt is going to use this incident and some others to get America closer to the war. In fact, it's an executive order, and he makes an announcement as well. From here on in, the United States Navy is going to assist the Royal Canadian Navy in escorting convoys going to the British Isles from Halifax and other ports in Canada, as far east as Iceland. From here, the Royal Navy takes up the escort. June. You're now in the war. The Navy is in the war. And it's not going to be long before American destroyers and German U-boats are going to be swapping depth charges and torpedoes. June 22nd, 1941. Here, Hitler throws 3,300,000 troops against the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the greatest land war in modern times. This is the land campaign that's going to decide the land war for the entire Second World War. The land war in World War II was not decided in the Pacific, was not decided in North Africa, Sicily, England, or Italy, or France. Even after Normandy, France was a secondary front. The main event from June 22nd, 41 to May 7, 45 is the Eastern Front. It's the Soviets that beat the German army, not us and the Western Allies. They will do 90% of the fighting against the German army and 90% of the dying. The Soviets will lose some 25 million people in 47 months. Interesting. July 1941, the following month, the British occupy Iceland. They have a garrison on Iceland. There was the concern that the Germans would try to grab Iceland. But the British need those men in the North African desert. They're fighting the Italians and the Germans. They need those men. So they take that, they remove that garrison and ship them to North Africa. The United States will occupy Iceland. On July 7, 1941, the Navy lands 3,718 Marines. This is the first time in this war the United States Navy has moved troops from the United States to a foreign shore for these purposes. We're in the war already. Everyone thinks that we're going to get involved here in the Atlantic Theater. That's what most people are thinking here. And so by the summer, you're already involved in the war. The Navy is escorting convoys. American Marines are now on Iceland. You're getting closer to Europe here. September, October 1941, the Japanese carrier force is still training for the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the meantime, closing into October 1941, Hitler is ordering his troops on to take Moscow. Why? They've been at it too long. They should have defeated the Soviets by this point, but the Soviets are hanging on, fighting desperately. And so by beginning of October, the first snows have fallen. You've got your first ice. You've also had the thaw after that. Soviet roads, 90% of them are not paved. How do you think these dirt roads look after the snow and the ice melts? They're quagmires. At this point, the Japanese are almost done planning or training their crews for the attack on Pearl Harbor. American and Navy cryptographers, they are breaking the Japanese code, but it's the diplomatic code. It is not the military code. At the same time, the Germans, the British, are breaking the German code, Enigma. They are reading German traffic. The American code breakers are reading Japanese diplomatic traffic. Beginning of November 1941, the temperatures in the Soviet Union are plummeting at this point. Many German soldiers are still in their summer uniforms. Here at this point, the Japanese carrier task force in November is going to be moved to northern Japan. The attack force is going to leave northern Japan. The trek they're going to take is across the northern Pacific, out of the shipping lanes, in waters that at times are tempestuous, socked in rain squalls, so it can't be seen. But there's another Japanese task force being formed, and that's in southern Japan. The American code breakers know where this one is. They don't know where the carriers are, but they know this other convoy. Freighters, troop transports, cruisers, and destroyers. This one is going to be bound for the Dutch East Indies. That is the #1 target. Pearl Harbor is a major target, yes, but the main target is the Dutch East Indies. Why? In 1941, the Dutch East Indies was the world's 4th largest producer of crude. All the Japanese have to do is grab the islands, and the wells are already dug. The Dutch have already dug the oil wells, and they can turn this into a Japanese gas station, is what they can do. November, getting into the latter part of November, 1941. The Germans Germans have been trying to encircle Moscow. On November 27, 1941, Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet commander in Moscow, launches a counterattack. trying to throw the Germans off their game as they close in on Moscow. On November 26th, the Japanese fleet ups anchor and begins to sail across the Pacific. Pardon me. And so they begin that 4,000-mile trek across the northern Pacific. On the night of December 4, as we close in on December 4, the Japanese, as they're sailing across the northern Pacific, have to approach Midway. They go beyond, they're supposed to go beyond Midway, circle Midway, and head south for their takeoff points just outside Pearl Harbor. But on the night of December 4-5, 1941, Georgy Zhukov launches the counterattack against the German troops, trying to surround Moscow. The lead German units are only 15 miles from the Kremlin. They can see the spires of the Kremlin. It's almost like they can reach out and touch them. The temperatures are 35 to 40 degrees below zero. Zhukov launches this counterattack at night. This counterattack will keep going until the end of February 1942, and they're able to push the Germans back at least 100 miles from Moscow. But 2 days after Zhukov launches his counterattack, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. Now the world's #1 and #2 industrial powers are now on the same side. Pearl Harbor might seem to be a defeat to many Americans. But what is the long-term progression here? It is not. It's a tactical defeat, yes. But the turning point of this war is right here, December 4-5 to the 7th. Why? Because now the United States and the Soviet Union are now allies. And both these countries are going to win this war. The turning point is now. Midway is a turning point in the Pacific. El Alamein was a turning point in the Desert War. Stalingrad is a turning point on the Eastern Front. The turning point of the war is now, because now it's really a global conflict. The Atlantic theater is joined with the Pacific theater. And the two countries that are going to win this to fight such an industrialized war such as this, have those scales of industrialization, especially the United States. They also have large populations to replace losses. This is particularly true with the Soviet Union. Plus, they have that one resource you need in abundance to win an industrialized war on this scale, and that's called oil. From here on in, the Germans are now stuck fighting a war of attrition they cannot afford to wage. The Japanese will now be stuck in a war of attrition they can't afford to wage. And you know who understands this very well? A man in London. He's having a dinner party, and he's having his dinner party with John J. Winnett, the United States ambassador to England for the United States, and Averell Harriman. It's 8 o'clock at night, 8:30 at night, and they're at Chequers, the prime minister's home outside London. And an adjutant comes in with a notice. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Churchill gives it to Winnett. Winnett's eyes get as big as his glasses, who in turn gives it to Harriman. Harriman reads it, gives it back to Churchill. Churchill orders a radio. They have a radio brought in. The messages they're getting are sketchy. No one knows a lot here outside Pearl Harbor. Nobody knows a lot. So they're getting this information. Churchill orders paper and pencil. He's going to declare war on the Japanese. Winnett says to him, aren't you going to ask for confirmation here? Churchill is not asking for confirmation. He wants the United States in the war so bad he can taste it. But he phrases this in the most polite language possible. And this is his message. Listen to this. He's writing this to the Japanese embassy, which in turn is going to send this eventually to the emperor, right? Sir, On the evening of December 7, His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom learned that Japanese forces without previous warning, either in the form of a declaration of war or of an ultimatum with a conditional declaration of war, had attempted a landing on the coast of Malaya and bombed Singapore and Hong Kong. In view of these wanton acts of unprovoked aggression committed in flagrant violation of international law, and particularly of Article 1 of the Third Hague Convention, relative to the opening of hostilities to which both Japan and the United Kingdom are parties, His Majesty's ambassador at Tokyo has been instructed to inform the imperial government in the name of His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom that a state of war exists between our two countries. Now, note how he signs this. I have the honor to be, with high consideration, sir, your obedient servant, Winston S. Churchill. Now, he later says he will be criticized for being so polite. But typical Churchill, who has the last word, states, if you have to kill a man, it costs you nothing to be polite. But Churchill knows now at this point that no matter how long this is going to take, no matter how many people are going to be killed, no matter how much equipment is destroyed, or no matter how much money is going to be spent, the Allies are going to win. Only it's not going to be the Europeans that will win this. It will be the outsiders, the United States and the Soviet Union, the two countries that were ostracized from the League of Nations and the Versailles Treaty. Remember, when Wilson signed the Versailles Treaty, he can sign any treaty he wants. What does it say in your Constitution? The Senate has to ratify same. They don't ratify the Versailles Treaty. So we ostracize ourselves from European politics. The Soviets were ostracized because, God forbid, Russia had fallen sway to godless communism. Yet it's these two countries that are going to win the war. You know, the Europeans can no longer keep up fighting in an industrialized war of this capacity. And so you can see who's taking control of this war. 1942, the Germans will produce 5,997 tanks and assault guns. The Soviets, without our help, will produce 24,668 tanks and assault guns. Over 2,000 tanks a month are pouring off the assembly lines in the Ural Mountains. Chelyabinsk is the name of the city, with the slang name Tankograd. In fact, Chelyabinsk, it's not Detroit. Chelyabinsk is the world's largest tank producing combine. You think that Germans and Japanese have a chance to win this? No, they don't. And this war is going to be won by 1945. By 1945, it's the United States and the Soviet Union who win this. And this is the end of European dominance of the globe. The British and French empires, they're done. You have a new balance of power after September 2nd, 45. It's known as the United States and the Soviet Union. You lived through it. It's called the Cold War. That's what it's called. So Pearl Harbor and Moscow, December, is the turning point of this war, a war that did not start in 1939, a war that started in 1914. There's a progression of history for you. We don't seem to appreciate or even understand this concept. Of course, it's not taught here. Interesting. If anybody has any questions or comments or observations, they can make them now if they so choose to.
We have one comment, which is, wouldn't a study of Japanese military history have shown the Japanese like surprise? It's how they defeated the Russian fleet in 1905. They also spied on Pearl Harbor, which helped with surprise, but failed to have an espionage network that would last for a long war. Comments?
Yeah, that's true. Very few remember that the Japanese launched the surprise attack in 1904 against the Russian fleet. They forgot this. In fact, another aspect of this is in 1934, I think it was, the aircraft carriers Lexington and Saratoga were used to launch an attack, a practice attack on Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning. and this attack succeeded. Interesting what people forgot here. What really, this progression of history, and unless you keep up on this, yes, people are going to make mistakes here, and they're going to repeat the mistakes of the past. Isn't that the saying here? Man always repeats. History repeats itself. Right. Fascinating. Truly is. Truly fascinating.
Really fascinating. Thank you. And that's all we have as far as questions or comments. Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for attending this afternoon's programming event. And I hope you've enjoyed Mark's deep dive into the events at Pearl Harbor and other countries. Thank you again for watching, and bye for now.
Have yourselves a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you, Mark. Bye-bye now.
Welcome. Bye-bye now.